Professor Fred Babweteera of Makerere University is a leading voice in forest conservation and ecological restoration in Uganda. With extensive research, policy engagement, and leadership in national and international networks, he provides critical insights into how invasive species impact ecosystems and the strategies needed to manage them sustainably. Fred, I'm looking forward to hearing your speech. Go ahead.
Hope it's still morning for most of us. Right. So what I thought I would cover just in about 5 or 6 slides, maybe to give a little bit of background, my involvement in invasive species management. I've been doing some assignment and still ongoing on looking at invasive species, specifically in Queen Elizabeth National Park, working alongside the Food and Agriculture Organization with the UN. And what I'm going to do really is to share my thoughts with more regards to building up on what Julia and Graham have presented, but contextualizing it in terms of what I perceive as the key challenges that we need to think through. And then what are some of the recommendations and 3 key areas that I'm going to focus on in terms of the recommendations. I'm glad Graham has really nailed a number of the things that I wanted to touch base on. So I won't take up a lot of time, but bring them into the context of Uganda. So we have a unique scenario, and Carol did mention this in her opening remarks, that we are really dealing more with indigenous invasive plant species, not alien or exotic plant species. And then the question we need to really dig deep into is why are these indigenous plant species expressing hyperdominancy at this stage? What is really driving their hyperdominance in these landscapes? The other challenge that I've noted is and this is not unique to Uganda Wildlife Authority. Possibly it's a cancer that is affecting us as a country. The reactive management approach. Rarely do we sit back to be proactive in our management strategies. More like if I have a car, and as long as I can start it and it moves, I'll keep going until it breaks down. That's when I'll start thinking about, okay, how do I get a mechanic to look at this? Yet a proactive management approach would have aided in detecting and maybe taking some steps to address the problem before it gets out of hand. Interacting with a colleague from FAO who was asking me about what do you think? My one quick statement to him was this is no longer a problem that should be left to UWA to manage. I think it's a matter of national importance. We are dealing with a resource that we are claiming is a key revenue earner for the country, but at the same time, we are not providing the necessary support to deal with the current problem. And I'm glad Carol really emphasized this, that it's a much bigger problem than we initially anticipated. And the longer we take to deal with it, the more it becomes problematic for us to resolve it. The other challenge that I've seen is the limited spatial distribution assessments of the invasive species. When I did talk to a number of managers, they do talk about this as a problem, but when it comes to quantifying what's the real problem, for instance, what proportion of the park is covered with dicrostachys or other indigenous species, normally you get some estimates, but not quite quantitative. And so if we don't know the extent of the problem, it becomes very hard to go through the steps that Graham did emphasize. How do you plan when you don't know how much you have to deal with? But also knowing that the species covers may be 41% or 50% of the national park or the conservation area. The question would be, is it in similar densities? There are some areas that are low density, some are high density, some are moderate, and therefore the approach or the priority areas you want to start with could be different. And so it's important really for us to have a very good understanding of the spatial distribution of these invasive species. As we possibly think about making this problem a matter of national concern and possibly this matter going to cabinet and going to parliament, we must have these statistics. If we are asked how much of the park is affected, giving some vague answers might not be helpful because it will give an impression that we actually don't understand or appreciate the magnitude of the problem. And then the cost-benefit analysis of the strategies that are being used. FAO had an interest in engaging the communities, trying to look at how they can scale up engagement of the communities in the manual extraction. But what's the cost-benefit analysis of that strategy? I had Carol at the start mention the reluctance, and I think I've heard this in many circles, the reluctance to use chemical, the herbicide control. Now, we need to be open-minded and think about what do we stand to lose and what do we stand to gain in the long run if we do not have a clear understanding of the costs or the benefits that are accrued to the different methods. Then the significance of the different invasive species. Reading through the strategic plan, again, it was giving some understanding of the different species, but which, if we are asked, what are the species of least concern? What are the species of major concern? And what are the species that maybe it's a growing concern that we are categorizing them? Yes, we are talking about 60 or 70 different invasive plant species. But are these of similar concern? Or, as Carol, you mentioned in your presentation, dicrostature seems to be definitely of a major concern. How do we categorize these? And in our planning, it will give us a headway or a way to think through on the strategies of how to deal with these species. Then the sustainability of the financing mechanisms. I found this to be really a big challenge, whereby some of the areas where, for instance, manual extraction of mainly dicrostachys was going on, there was a problem that the funding mechanisms cannot be guaranteed. And the fact that there was a need to revisit these areas to uproot the resprouts or the regrowth, the lack of follow-up would mean that all the effort that has been put in for the last 2-3 years could actually go to waste. How are we putting in place sustainable financing mechanisms to ensure that the actions we are going to take are going to be to have a long-term effect? And then finally, and possibly, in my opinion, most important, and this is where I'm going to focus on in terms of the recommendations, the monitoring protocols. We do not have a good understanding of the spread of these species. Some of this information is actually among individuals, but not documented. And given that there is always a practice of transferring staff from one unit to another, it's very possible that this information actually, we lose it over time. We cannot know what took place. I'll give a quick example here. I think there were some chemical trials on dicrostachys in Queen Elizabeth. Now, one of the questions we're interested in getting information about when we're doing this assignment was what herbicide was used, what quantities were used, and over what time period. And this was quite scanty. Now, a lack of such information would mean we might not quite understand what was the effect. If we want to do follow-ups of monitoring, people are asking what is the effect of chemical application on the habitat, on the other species, on the animals. And unless we have this information kept together, it's very hard for us to have a meaningful management strategy. I've been combing through literature, and you find a lot, actually, there's a lot of work that has been going on, but you can hardly find reports or literature on these activities. And that makes it very, very difficult for us to have a sustainable management strategy. So the monitoring of what is being done, how it was done, when it was done, and the follow-ups would be very, very important. Now, as I said, for me, this is what I really regarded as the key practical challenges that we need to address. And I wanted now to move into what are the three key recommendations. The first one, Graham has already nailed it. Looking through the strategy, beautiful document, but we need to really dig deeper into transforming this strategy into action plans, into reactivities. And we need to look at the long term. This problem that we are dealing with is not a problem that we can fix in the next 5 or 10 years. It's a problem that we are going to take a long time. And I don't want to scare us, but I simply want to say we are in for a long job, a long time job. We are going to have to dig deep into our skills, into our resources to deal with this problem. It's not a problem that we are going to fix in a short time. Then two, Julie started off this, and I think also Graham mentioned it. A number of our parks, like Queen Elizabeth, the Bwindi Mugahinga area, Kidepo, these are cross-border national parks, and we need to be mindful of meta-population dynamics. We cannot manage these invasive species as if it's an island. There are some reasons why we have hyperdominance because of maybe the foraging patterns and the densities of some of the animal, the wildlife that could be altering the species hyperdominance. So we need to keep an eye on what's happening in DRC Congo. We need to keep an eye on the movement of the large herbivores that could be shaping the population dynamics of these species. The third aspect on the comprehensive action plan is more on partnerships in financing. It's interesting to see that a number of partners are actually picking up interest and asking questions. What is UWA doing and how can we come in support? I think it would be good for UWA to have a comprehensive plan that any entity that wishes to come in and support, they are feeding into the same action plan. And the action plan that is park-based, it's important for it to be as comprehensive as possible, not negating any options that are available. And on this point, as much as my background in ecology and resource use and sustainability, I would say let us not close our eyes to chemical weed management. It is an option to save the habitats. We can stand to lose certain aspects, but we cannot afford to lose the habitat because once that's gone, however much we do the marketing, I had Carol mention this, the disappointment of tourists, of visitors, we cannot stand to say we are not going to do this, yet we are losing the very core of the industry that we are looking at. And then the fourth aspect on the action plan is capacity development. I think this is an area that needs to be strengthened, and I'm glad and appreciate Share Screen Africa for this partnership in bringing and connecting us to colleagues in South Africa that have gone ahead of us. We can really enhance partner capacity development by tapping into some of our partners in what they've done over the years. The second recommendation is on comprehensive spatial distribution assessments. I think this is important. And here I wanted to make some recommendation on very, very low cost technologies. We'll be sharing this report with UWA definitely once we have concluded aspects of it. This is an example of the distribution of dicrostachys in Queen Elizabeth. And basically what we did, just took different patches, developed spectral signatures of dicrostachys, and then were able to have these estimates. And I think, if I recall the figures off my head, we did estimate about 41% of the park affected by dicrostachys, about 28% of the park affected by lantana, but also looking at what would classify as low density, moderate density, high density. About 39% of the park is actually affected with high density population densities of these species. So we can tap into low-cost technologies that can help us do the spatial distribution assessments of the different species. Then we can identify the hotspots. And following the management guidelines, where should we start? It shouldn't be a sporadic approach of the communities are doing manual extraction. Maybe they start on this end. Why is that criteria of where it should start? Should we start from, as Graham was mentioning, the low density areas where we know it could get worse, and conclude with the high density areas where it can never get worse because it's at its peak? Then the third aspect is in these spatial distribution assessments, looking at the drivers, like the dicrostachys. What's driving the distribution of these species? Is it the foraging patterns of elephants? Is it the soil properties? There is literature that shows soil differences in soil properties that could trigger the spread of the species. However, there is also a strong link to the foraging patterns of elephants. And how is that providing a positive feedback pathway that is making the problem worse? Then the third and final strategy is, as I mentioned, for me, monitoring is very, very critical. There have been interventions taking place over the last possibly 4 or so years. And then have we gone ahead to put in place, for instance, permanent sample plots to look at changes in species densities over a spatial period? Do we say at what rate are we seeing these species multiplying? And that can help us to draw scenarios. If it's business as usual, no action is taken, what would be the projected spread of these species? One of the things we're trying to do, and I hope this will be also part of the report that we'll be sharing with UWA on specifically dicrostachys, is having looked at the 2025 spatial distribution, using the same spectral signatures, we are stepping back to about 8-9 years, where we can get high resolution images to see what was the coverage then and what is the coverage in 2025, to see where the hotspots are developing in terms of high density areas, and what proportion of the park is now considered to be covered by high density aspects of the dicrostachys species, but also possibly lantana. So it's important to set in place sample plots in the long term where we can monitor the management interventions that have taken place in here and how is that changing over time. People were asking about the chemical effects of chemical use. If we look at the residual effects in the plots that were where it was applied using the liquid chromatography mass spectrometry, I think we can find if there are any traces of some of these chemicals that were used. Again, it emphasizes the importance of what quantities were used and what herbicides were used so that we're able to assess exactly if there are any residuals, and in those same plots, how is the vegetation responding over time. Then the second aspect in terms of comprehensive monitoring strategy are the recovery pathways, the succession pathways. Joseph and colleagues that I did interact with had a very, very good understanding of areas where they have removed manually extracted the dicrostachys and then the Parthenium taking root. However, if we do not have permanent sample plots where we can monitor the densities of the different species that are coming through, it becomes a really tough job for us to have a meaningful long-term strategy. And then finally, the last slide, records management. Records. Management history of what has been done it can be a challenge. How many times have we revisited an area to do the manual extraction? How many times have we, if we are to go the chemical way, have we applied a particular herbicide? We need to be careful not to be excited about it. I know tomorrow we are going to delve into chemical weed management, but bearing in mind that we shouldn't excite ourselves and misuse it to the extent of starting to develop herbicide resistance over time, because that would be a disaster for us if it's the only strategy that can be cost effective in the long term. And then finally, the interactive impacts of these invasive species and climate change on the ecosystem, but also on the recreation and tourism facilities. What are we seeing over time? The photo that I'm sharing there, as you can see, the bottom photo, those were wrist sprouts of dicrostachys. And this was an area, I think it was 6 months after the extraction, the manual extraction that took place. Now, how sustainable is this? That by allowing these wrist sprouts to come through, and we do not have a comprehensive and sustainable financing mechanisms, are we really throwing money in a ditch that in a short time, we are actually going to have a much, much bigger problem to deal with? So as I conclude, my thoughts on the challenges that we are dealing with, one of the things that we need to quickly delve into is breaking down the strategy into actionable points, and the focus should be in the long term, not a quick fix. The number two, having a comprehensive assessment of our parks. And then finally, how even before we start taking any strategies, we need to set up some monitoring aspects to gather data to help us understand the starting points that we can make reference to on how effective we are with our different methods and strategies. Thank you so much, and I'll end it here.
Thank you, Fred. That was wonderful. Yeah, thank you for your experience and your insight. I think in timely support of the action plan that UA is developing. Yeah, I kind of have a feeling that you should be you would be a very great advisor to the Ugandan Wildlife Authority. So, just putting that out there. Yeah, thank you for providing an eagle's eye view of what is needed to manage this tricky situation of invasive plant species. And and obviously the importance of monitoring and assessment and the according plan adaptation. So thank you very, very much. I see a hand up by Emmanuel. Emmanuel, go ahead.
Good morning once again. And thank you again for that wonderful presentation. I brought in a very good strategy on how to manage our species. So this is based on science, and it's also based on data. And you brought out the aspect of also use of AI or the GIS to monitor the progress, which I like so much. You know, over and over again, as ecologists, we tend to base our monitoring system on ecosystem health and ecosystem services provision on plant life. And Prof, you're able to build a very strong case for how this can be done, especially when it comes to invasive species. I'm wondering whether there are any existing, probably monitoring tools which we can be able to adopt to effectively monitor and address or manage our invasive species. That's my question number one. Then question number two, still on monitoring once again. Do you have any publication which we can also borrow literature from, so that as we undertake our invasive species management within our sanctuaries, then we can be able to have a good reference point? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emmanuel. Those are really good questions. The first one on monitoring tools, yes, there are frameworks for monitoring, especially ecosystem health and plant resource dynamics. In a way, the tool, in my opinion, has to be tailored more to what is the problem that you're trying to monitor, and the extent of what strategy you've laid down. Julie did take us through the context in which we look at the management. Is it over a short-term context? Is it mid-term, or is it long-term? If we are looking at 100 years, the kind of monitoring framework will be a lot more different from a strategy that is looking at a 10-year or 5-year intervention plan. So yes, there is there are monitoring framework tools that I would be happy to share with you to guide on developing site-specific monitoring strategies. Then, in terms of publications, again, as Julie did mention, there are lots and lots of publications now that have come on board after realizing that this is actually a growing problem. And over the next, if I'm not mistaken, over the next 50 years, it could possibly be the number one problem that are affecting biodiversity. And I would be happy to share some of these publications with you as well.
Thank you, Fred. There's a comment from Caroline saying that was a wonderful presentation, Fred, and we agree with the analysis and recommendations on the way forward, breaking down the strategy into actions. We look forward to harvesting more from your knowledge. There we go. So, a question for you from Philemon Tumwe Baze, who's also with the Ugandan Wildlife Authority. Thank you very much, Professor. Which work were you doing in Queen Elizabeth National Park? When and the outcomes? When was chemical use applied in Queen Elizabeth National Park?
All right, thank you, Tumwebaze. Yes, the work that we are doing, as I said, it's ongoing. We started these assessments. It's a study that was commenced or supported by the Food Agriculture Organization of the UN. And as I mentioned, their specific interest was in how to partner with the local communities to harvest, to use the manual extraction, but then add value to the dicrostachys, mainly dicrostachys harvest that they get. Now, their interest was to see how can they incorporate this into the sustainable charcoal production value chain network project that they were running. Well, that program did end. However, they are doing a follow-up, and they were interested in looking at what other products, for instance, biochar, that could be supported in that. So it's an ongoing project, and we hope that we'll be able to conclude the final report sometime in February and share it with UWA. One of the things that I did note, and I'm glad that Joseph is here, one of the, he was, I think, the head research and monitoring in that time when we visited. There was a challenge that there were some studies that were done on the similar topic, but then accessing some of the results or reports from that was quite a challenge. And that's why I was mentioning that records management would be very, very important. Then for the question of chemical trials, they were done, I think, if I'm not mistaken, I could be corrected by Joseph or someone who could have the exact some of the information. Again, this is the problem that when you try to ask these questions, there was an indication in 2002, possibly, by UCF, I think. They did some trials on that track to Mwea, somewhere. There were some trials done there. And again, the limitation we had is that we didn't get the whole picture of which chemical was used, what quantities were used, but there was an idea of where it was used. And we managed to take some coordinates and pick some soil samples to try and see if there are any traces of any especially 2,4-D, which is the suspected herbicide that we thought was used.
Thank you, Fred. I see that there's a question from Johan. Johan, go ahead.
Thanks, Kirsten. So there's a continuous concern about soil microbiota that could be impacted by chemical treatment. So I was just wondering, with the invasive species targeting areas where soil has been disturbed, if there has been any studies to look at the soil biota of the area where the invasion is, because I'm just wondering if it is not already in a very peculiar state, that it's not at a good level that you would want it to be to begin with, and that the concern is basically preempted by that.
Oh, interesting. Thank you for that question, Johan. Now, the challenge here is again, when I asked about the chemical application that was done, one of the interests was to understand, before that was applied, were there any data that were taken in terms of the species composition, in terms of the soil properties, in terms of the soil microorganisms, and that was not quite clear. Again, we wouldn't know what the impacts would be if we didn't take that important data at the start, where we can convincingly say, yes, by doing this trial, which they said was a trial indeed, we can confidently apply this. So in a way, we would be relying a lot on the experiences that our colleagues in South Africa you've had in the different herbicides. But again, the recommendation possibly to be more conscious would be, before we scale it up, can we do some trials, but do them in a very chronological way, assess before we take any actions, and then monitor over time to see what are the impacts on the soil biota, soil microorganism, but also the species recovery over time after the application. So it is, as I said, we are in for a long journey. And for me, one of the things that I would really try to emphasize is UWA. I wished the top management were in this meeting. They should prioritize support to the monitoring department, because we would lose the habitats. We can market Uganda so much, but if we are not taking the basics of preserving or protecting the habitat for which we are based on, then we are really wasting time. So I wish, I don't know who can reach them for such trainings. It would be important for some of this top management to be in such meetings so that they take the discussion to, to the boardroom to make these decisions.
Yeah, here. Thanks, Fred. I've got a question in the chat from Jose Arjuang. And he says, quite in depth, Mr. Fred. I think most of the approaches that we have been using aren't usually guided through research and policies. How do we effectively rope in local communities in invasive species management?
Very, very interesting, Hosea. Very, intriguing question. I think one of the key approaches is first and foremost for communities to understand that the species that we are dealing with is not only problematic in the park, but it can be problematic if it crosses over to their properties as well. And I remember in some of the sites I visited, we actually found Parthenium and Dicrostachys on some of the farmlands neighboring Queen Elizabeth National Park. So it is important for communities to appreciate that the species that we are dealing with, they know no boundaries, and they can easily be problematic in their own landscapes, in their farmlands. Then secondly, again, it's a learning process that we need to carefully look at. I know that FAO, for instance, is very excited about finding resources, finances to support more of the community involvement in the manual extraction as a way of the sustainable and more eco-friendly extraction or management of Dicrostachys. The question I want to again relate to what Julie did present. It's not a species that we should be too friendly to, because it can cause more problems than we think. So I think we should tread carefully on the line where we are trying to promote its value addition aspects vis-a-vis the long-term damage it can create. But engaging the communities in terms of awareness of the dangers of this species getting out of hand, but then secondly, involving them in understanding the management strategies that are being put in place. If at all, for instance, we are to use chemical the chemical management, for them also to understand that this can have effects on their livestock, that they shouldn't just cut and paste the strategies that are being employed in a rather non-scientific way. But it's a thin line that we have to be careful not to excite communities in terms of the value addition, but at the same time for them to be very much aware of the potential effects of the invasive species in the landscape, even into their own farmlands.
Thank you, Fred. Yeah, very important. Graham, go ahead.
Thank you. Let me start with the comments I think it was made by Philemon and comments that Fred has now made. And Fred, thank you. I think you're definitely on the right track of where you're looking and what and I like where your thinking is going. With the local communities, South Africa's got a flawed but relatively effective working forward program where we train local people to clear invasives in their area. It's not necessarily just for them, it might be in the park, but they can also use that training to clear their areas. That's one point. Another one is the Parthenium in the local community farmlands scares me significantly. That's an easy problem to solve, correct herbicides, correct all the details, and for them to spray with the correct training to spray that and stop it. There's presentations been made in South Africa. Lorraine might have some of these pictures tomorrow of how bad it gets where it actually decimates the communities. So we need to look at that one very, very quickly. And the training ties with that. Coming back to comments that from Johan and on the soil biota, Fred, if the herbicide is applied in 2020, your chances of finding anything now is 0 to nothing. It will have broken down by now. The herbicide 2,4-D was totally the wrong one. And then I know it's not your issues there. And then there is a PhD, I think it's a PhD being written at the moment in South Africa where they've taken invasive species programs and they've looked at the soil under different herbicide treatments to look at the biota and what the impacts they've had on the biota. So there is research that will be coming out very shortly on that sort of thing. Thank you.
Thanks, Graham. Fred, do you want to respond?
Not really, because I think he was elaborating and giving some useful information. Yes.
Okay, perfect, Fred.
On the 2,4-D. Yeah.
I see that there's a question from Lawrence Kajura, who's the species specialist at Queen Elizabeth National Park for the Ugandan Wildlife Authority. He was just asking, is it possible to share the coordinates of where the plots were for follow-up? I guess the monitoring plots.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'll share those with him. And indeed, in the report that we are putting together, we also indicating all the plots where we collected this data that they can make follow-ups if they are interested in these exact plots. And maybe also to mention, part of their exercise will be to establish permanent sample plots that we are still discussing protocols on how to monitor them, joint arrangements between Makerere University, UWA, and possibly support from a food agriculture organization on monitoring these plots. But the protocols and the locations is what's remaining to be decided, and that information will be shared with UWA once it's completed.
Thanks very much, Fred. Super. Then there is a comment from, well, let me just see if it's a question. Yeah, I think it's a comment from Edward Mwavu. The issue of invasives is now beyond the national parks in Uganda. There is now an invasive plant species ravaging grazing lands and forest plantations in Uganda. It is more aggressive than Lantana camara. This therefore calls for a nationwide approach to managing invasive plants.
Exactly. Thank you, Professor Mwavu. I think you've nailed it that, as I mentioned, I don't think invasive species management should be now a matter that we leave to UWA. It's a matter of national interest. And looking at the porous aspects of our management approaches, Uganda is one of the countries where you can bring in any plant species somehow, and no one will really question, do you have a phytosanitary certificate or whatever? Somehow things end up here. And we're sitting on a time bomb. We need to pick our actions. I remember I used to sit on the National Seed Board, and about 10 years ago, And I'm really surprised that the number of proposals we put across for stringent actions in terms of movement of plant specimens or plant species from into the country have not been effected. And so I think it's high time that as a country, possibly led by UWA, we should make this a matter of national importance. It's no longer a matter that we can sit on. If you look at the different forest reserves, they are affected by a number of alien exotic plant species, and they're changing significantly the ecology of those protected areas, especially forest reserves. So it is indeed, Professor Mav, you're right. It is a bigger problem that still growing, and we seem not to appreciate how terrible it can be if we don't take any actions.
Thanks, Fred. And thanks, Edward. I have a experience, let's say, from Anelia Murray. She says a few years ago, she was attending a local flower club meeting, and she was amazed at how the people there were boasting about how they had smuggled plants into South Africa purely because they thought it would make a good addition to a flower arrangement. Yeah, there's a good, not good seed to sow.
Mm-hmm. Indeed, I think that's the problem, that we seem to think it's a small problem, or it's a good idea to do something, but actually the long-term effects can be devastating.
Absolutely. Okay, and then I see that there's a question from Johan. Thank you very much for all your questions. Very good questions. Go for it, Johan.
Just curious. First of all, thank you so much to Uganda Wildlife Authority for sharing this problem with us, because we're basically using Uganda today as a case study for a problem that is prevalent with similar problems in the rest of Africa, including areas in South Africa. The area where I am is basically covered in agriculture, and every inch that's not covered by agriculture is covered by invasives. It's an incredible, difficult problem to manage outside protective areas as well. But I was just wondering if maybe Graham or Prof. Fred, if you are aware, if artificial intelligence will be used to predict the spread of and where the spread of invasive species would take place. It would be interesting to know if that tool is being used in monitoring and predicting.
Fred, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll go first. Yeah, we've got one of our PhD students actually who is trying to look at use of AI to predict and two particular species, lantana and Dicrostachys. Indeed, there are prospects. I think there are very good prospects of use of AI to look at the drivers of the distribution of species and tell which where it's likely to be expanding. The complication with it is a fluid landscape, that the social dynamics influencing landscape use are quite fluid and quite dynamic. But it would be interesting for this PhD student to see what predictions he can come up with in view of those socio-economic dynamics in a landscape. But it's something that definitely we need to invest in, because it's a low-cost way of us being able to tell and predict what will happen.
Thanks, Professor Fred, and thanks, Johan. Graham, would you like to come in on that same question?
Just a very quick comment on that. We've done modeling of invasive species distribution for years, and the AI would just be the natural follow-on from that. The cynical remark is, Africa is the next invasion area. Sorry, I should leave the last one out.
Hello. Thanks, Graham. Right. Are there any more questions from our audience? Sorry, somebody's saying something.
Carol here.
Oh, Caroline, go for it.
Yeah, I wanted to add on what Fred mentioned. I think I also think that AI would be a very good tool to use in prediction of the next target for our invasives. However, for us to move in that direction, if we could indeed identify the driving factors, where is lantana spreading, what is favoring it to establish, what are the land use patterns that are driving to its sprouting and expansion and establishment. If we could know these factors, the soil factors, the temperature which favors it, and all those other factors, I think it would be very good to predict and easy to predict with AI. Recently, I saw we had a student, a PhD student, who was doing, she was looking at the distribution of pangolins, and she had all these favorable factors for the giant pangolin and what favors it to exist. So she went around and did the study, and she put all her information, the factors, into one model. And indeed, the model showed her where the pangolins are likely to be found in the country. If we did the same and put all the favorable factors that are leading to the establishment and the spread of these invasives, probably would predict which area is likely to be invaded next. And then would try to put up measures in time. So AI, to me, I believe is a good way to go. Thank you.
Thanks, Caroline, for that. Okay, I'm going to just read out a question from the chat. So, hello, experts. This is a general observation from my experience with invasive plant species management at Queen Elizabeth National Park. This is by Joseph Arinatwa, who's also working with the Ugandan Wildlife Authority. He says, soon after target sites are cleared from invasive plants, whether mechanically or manually, herbivores quickly return to the sites and overgraze on regenerating palatable plant species, thus giving way for the unpalatable or invasive species to resprout and intensify without any or with very minimal competition. Could there be a reasonable approach to controlling such overgrazing during the interventions until native plants are fully established to a level of effective resilience to grazing? I think that's a very good question. Fred?
Oh, that's a very tough question to to imagine. I think that's the challenge. Joseph is really highlighting a very practical challenge that as we take these actions, there's a positive feedback that is creating that's worsening the situation, possibly not with the same invasive species, but other invasive species. I can't really say that I have a practical solution on how to limit overgrazing in areas that have been sort of restored. However, what I would look at is the spatial extent of the interventions. The smaller the area that we restore, the higher the chances that the animals are going to be drawn to that. And so instead of having small incremental approaches to restoration of the invaded areas, we need to look at a more massive engagement so that we do not create overgrazing in a specific area. The distribution of the grazers continuously is spread out rather than being clumped in a smaller area. That's possibly the best I could think about.
Thanks, Fred. Yes, definitely a multidisciplinary approach is required. Graham, your hand is, oh, sorry, let's go first to Emmanuel from the Giraffe Center. Go for it.
Hello.
Yes,
Manuel,
we can hear you.
I think I like discussions which are coming out of this presentation. I know the three presenters did quite a great job. When it comes to invasive species management, I think one size cannot fit all, and Professor Fred brought it very well. Like we have to try to localize our approaches so that we don't just borrow what is being done in a different area, then you find that it cannot be able to work for you. I know the Giraffe Center Sanctuary, we've done very well in terms of management of the Lantana Camara, but we use the mechanical method of control, but we say we have to be more proactive other than reactive, so that you address the problem, before it gets out of hand. I've seen that in Nairobi National Park, where now Lantana Camara is also becoming a big menace that it has established itself and it's wiping out other important species for the browsers. I know again, as we do it, sometimes we ask because you eradicate one of the invasive, then you also bring in like another species will set in. And again, like Lantana Camara, it's a preferred species by the mouse birds because of the berries and also the height barbers. Wherever they are found in this country, then there must be Lantana Camara. And I know one of the sanctuaries in central parts of Kenya, Wajir Park, which is very famous for the height barbara in Kenya. Like it's like the hub of, height barbara conservation. If you remove the lantana bushes, then that you spell doom to that species. So we have to do everything with a bit of moderation. We also base it on science, the way Fred put it, and we also try to localize our efforts. Like what can work well for Giraffe Center might be different from what can work in Uganda and also what can work in South Africa and the like. But we have to find synergies and see which methods we can be able to borrow in terms of the effectiveness. I don't know, we kind of blaming South Africa for the Parthenium, which found its way to our country. And it's taking off grazing lands in the rangelands, both in protected wildlife areas and also in livestock pastoral areas. So how do we deal with this? Because it's a big threat to our local livelihood, habitat and biodiversity conservation. Thank you.
Fred, would you like to respond?
Yes, I think there was earlier comment that Julie did share in terms of the experience on managing Parthenium. And to me, this is the beauty of having this forum. And thanks again to Share Screen Africa for bringing us together, that there's knowledge in different parts of this continent that we can tap into and find synergies on how to avoid reinventing the wheel. So Share Screen Africa, thank you so much for this opportunity for us to share this and learn of expertise elsewhere. Now, when it comes to the emphasis that he's mentioned about science-based management interventions, I think at the end of the day, this is where we should really focus, that we cannot it's possible that we can tailor an approach that worked well in South Africa, but in some way, the local context in Uganda or in Kenya might be a little bit different. That requires us again to adopt, but also amend protocols on how we are implementing different strategies based on our legal framework or based on our policies. So yes, I appreciate that, and more so why we should continue such interactions to share best practices across the board.
Thank you, Fred. Graham, would you like to go ahead?
Thank you. Just the one comment that Fred has just made. Taking things from South Africa to Uganda and modifying them. That's why we're not recommending herbicides at this stage and saying use this, use that, because they might need modification. They might not work as well there as they work down here. So definitely we need to look at things, or Uganda needs to look at things and modify them as required. As far as the reinvasion after clearing is concerned and the grazers coming in, the herbivores coming in, manual clearing, one of the options might be just to leave the, especially on a small scale, is to leave the trash or the timber as it falls. And you then got a bit of a protection area on the ground to stop some of the herbivores grazing. I don't want to take away from tomorrow's presentation, but Dicrostachys is managed aerially in South Africa. You do large areas at once, and then you haven't got that high pressure area for grazing. You've got the timber that stays standing, and you have pockets of vegetation that will develop in amongst that the herbivores can't get to. And you have less chance of invasion because you're not damaging the ground and the re-establishment of plants nearly as much as you would with manual clearing. Thank you.
Thanks, Graham. I have a question from Caroline. We are thinking of using electric portable fences around the sample plots, and also, if possible, where we plan to remove invasives and allow natural regenerations and rehabilitation. Has someone used that? And then a note, in Uganda, we are already using electric fences in managing human-wildlife conflicts. We use non-lethal voltage. Fred, do you want to respond to that?
Sorry, I was muted. I'm not privy to areas where I know Uganda Wildlife Authority has used electric fencing in a number of areas quite effectively. Again, for the sample plots, one of the things that we would be interested in is rather than exclude the natural the natural plant animal interactions, is actually to leave them to experience that so that it mimics the exact conditions where we'll possibly not be excluding animals. I don't know the cost benefit aspect on use of fencing in the areas that have been restored, whether that could be an approach, or looking at, for instance, what Graham was mentioning, that instead of taking out, that you limit the spaces that allow for regeneration of other invasives, could be a more better way of managing the habitat without heavy costs. But again, these are, I think, areas that UWA, we could have more in-depth discussions with other experts like Graham that have gone ahead of us to see how we can have a more comprehensive and cost-effective approach to the management.
Thank you, Fred. I'm going to close up soon. I just wanted to read out Professor Julie Coetzee's take-home messages, and I think they're they apply very strongly to our discussion. So she says, my take-home messages, this is fundamentally a land management crisis and not an alien species invasion. Removal without addressing fire and grazing regimes is like bailing water from a sinking boat without fixing the hole. Wildlife populations aren't just conservation targets, they're ecosystem managers. Their decline is partly why woody encroachment exploded. The fact that these species were here 60 years ago without being problems proves the solution isn't eradication, it's restoring the conditions that kept them in balance. Climate change is real and accelerating, but proper management can build resilience. Poor management makes systems vulnerable. Thank you, Julie, for that, those wise words. And I just want to say a very, very huge thank you to our experts, Professor Fred, Dr. Graham, Professor Julie, and also Caroline, Dr. Caroline. It's been amazing to listen to you and to learn from your wisdom. And thank you so much for all your generosity in sharing this with you.